I'm particularly pleased to be here today because, first of all, I spent many years in British Columbia and many hours at the BC Archives in the work that I was doing while I was there. So it's a pleasure to be back with the BC Archives team. I started my visits to the BC Archives as a filmmaker, and ended up more recently as a writer, sitting in the archives. But I want to talk about the importance of archival sources, and therefore the BC Archives, a little bit before I get too much into the book. I think, as many of you might know, the reason that I'm here today is because I wrote or co-wrote and edited a book last year called the Diary of Dukesang Wong, A Voice from Gold Mountain. And it's, as I think you probably know by now, about the experience of the Chinese in the early years of Canada, the late 19th century and early 20th century. And before I get into the book, I want to talk a little bit about its genesis. In 2004, I wrote and directed a film in collaboration with the Stalo Nation in BC, and worked closely with an ethnohistorian named Keith Carlson. The film was called The Lynching of Louis Sam, and it was largely based on a paper of the same name that Keith had written for a journal called BC Studies, which I'm sure you've also heard of. And it told the story of the lynching of a 14-year-old Stalo boy by an American lynch mob in 1884. And the source material that Dr. Carlson used was something that he found in the BC Archives. And it was a police report. And undercover police officers were sent into the Washington Territory by the BC government to investigate the lynching. And he used much of that report to write the article upon which the film was based. And in that report, there was a disturbing quote. And I beg your indulgence for repeating it here. It was not very nice. It was said to one of the police officers by a member of the lynch mob. And what he said was, "I'd kill a Chinaman as quick as I would an Indian, and I'd kill an Indian as quick as I would a dog." I was appalled by the racism and the disregard for human life that apparently directed at anyone who was not of European heritage. And it was then that I decided that after finishing the film, The Lynching of Louis Sam, about the lynching of this Indigenous boy, I begin a new film about the Chinese presence in North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the first two films that I made, that one and a film called Celesta Found, were made with the use of found archival information. Obviously, the lynching of Louis Sam was the material that was found in the BC, literally in the BC Archives. The other film was based on archival material found in a mouse-eaten, water-soaked cardboard box in the attic of a falling down log cabin in the woods in the eastern townships of Quebec. And in that box were a number of diaries and letters that had been written between 1897 and 1917 by a woman, a pioneer woman who lived in the community. And we spent 2 years transcribing the diaries. And it turned out that what we discovered was that the woman who wrote the diaries, who was an uneducated farm woman, started early in the diaries saying things like, "bought flour, cold today," made bread. And over time, as she made more and more entries into the diary, she essentially created herself. So that by the end of the diaries, she told an extraordinary story about life, the difficult life that she led during that time. That was a story that no one had ever heard before. It was in a cardboard box in the attic of a rundown log cabin in the woods. The stories that were told by the police officers in the lynching of Louis Sam story similarly had been in the BC archives and were available to be read, but hadn't been really looked at very much until Dr. Carlson took an interest in that particular story that they were telling. So those are two films that I could not have made without archival material and what they call personal stories, or from an original source. And so when I decided to make a film about the Chinese experience in Canada, I decided that I really, because it had worked for me before, that I would adopt the same process, and I would find something that I could use that was archival and that spoke, hopefully, with the voice of someone who was there. And unfortunately, as it turned out, there wasn't anything. And even I had read Pierre Burton's The Last Spike, and in that book, he had actually expressed his disappointment and sorrow that there were no first-person accounts of the Chinese experience in Canada, until the 1920s, and we know that throughout from 1880 on. Well, before that, of course, because of the Fraser Gold Rush, but particularly from 1880 on, when the CP rail was constructed in the country, that thousands of Chinese workers came to Canada. And their story has been told by historians and by records that the CP kept and so on. But throughout that time, there was never a personal voice. And I couldn't believe that if 17,000 men came to this country in the 1880s, that there wouldn't be some source, some written source somewhere that we could use to tell this story. So I began my project with the promise to myself and to the potential producers of the film that I would find something. I would set out to find something. And it was a struggle. I went to China. I looked there because a lot of the workers had gone back to China after their work on the railroad. And I looked through. I traveled through small towns in the Guangdong province, in the area called the Siyi, which were the four townships in southern Guangdong, where most of the men who came to Canada were from. And I went through little village archives, little village museums, looking for things. And unfortunately, although there were lots of articles that they brought back, lots of things that they brought back with them, and there were a few letters, and there were account books and so on, there was nothing like a diary of any kind. So I became a bit disillusioned, thinking I wasn't going to be able to do this. But there was one place that I hadn't looked, and that was right here in Canada. So I came back, and I started doing the same thing here as I had done there. I went to little museums and archives in small towns in British Columbia. I went to Agassiz and Ashcroft and Lytton, and several of them. And sure enough, I was working with a former archivist in a small BC museum, and together we found a single sheet of paper And on that single sheet of paper was a one-line quote from a diary attributed to this man named Dukesang Wong. And they also attributed the translation to his granddaughter, who had been apparently a student at Simon Fraser University in the 1960s. And she had done some translating of her grandfather's, quote, diaries, of which we knew nothing. So I contacted the SFU, and they told me they weren't able to give me any information appropriately. They weren't able to give me any information about their former students. But I also called the Alumni Association, and they agreed to contact this person who was an alumnus member, and they told her that I was looking for her and why. And they gave her my contact information and said it was up to her whether she wanted to contact me or not. Sure enough, a couple of days later, I got a call from her. And when I told her what I was doing, she said, well, I have this paper that I did for a professor at Simon Fraser University in the 1960s. And, it was based on my grandfather's diaries. And she said, I still have it somewhere in a box, somewhere in my garage. And I said, can I come to Ottawa? And she said, yes, please do. So a couple of days later, I got on an airplane and I flew to Ottawa. And I helped her go through boxes in her garage. And sure enough, we found this 59-page mimeographed, typewritten mimeographed copy of this paper that she had written that included many, many, many translations of the entries that her grandfather made in this diary. So this man, Dukesang Wong, was born in 1841, I think. I can't remember the exact date, but the principal event that started his diary keeping was the death of his father in 1867. And he spends another 10 years keeping this diary after that time, while he's in China. Then, and that's a fascinating story, absolutely fascinating story, which I'm not going to go into now because we have more important things to talk about. But it is a fascinating story of his life in China as it turns out, an educated Chinese man. And in 1880, for a variety of reasons, he decided that he needed to get away from China, and had heard all about the streets that were lined with gold in other parts of the world, and like really literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Chinese men left China to come to North America. And he landed in Portland, Oregon in 1880. Was unable to find work, had a very difficult time there for the 10 months that he spent there, and then was able to get a job building a railway north of Portland in a place that he wasn't familiar with, and I don't think knew it was a separate country from the United States. But he ended up in New Westminster, British Columbia, and spent the next 6 years of his life working on the building of the railroad. And throughout that entire time, and until 1917, when the diaries stopped, he kept a diary, which is an extraordinary record of a life lived. And of course, what's extraordinary about it is that it is the only, to our knowledge, the only existing record written firsthand that's available or extant, really, that we know of. I happen to believe that there are more things out there, and that someday other people will find, records as well. But I cannot stress enough the importance of original archival materials, which exist in places like archives and small museums and people's attics, to the telling of history. History is told by the winners. And yet there is so much history sitting in archives or sitting in cardboard boxes in fallen down cabins or sitting in people's attics or basements or garages that will allow us to tell extraordinary stories about the history of our country. So I wanted to start today by emphasizing that, by talking about how really, really important that is. I just remember, I'll read you the Pierre Burton quote in The Last Spike that piqued my desire to find something. He wrote, "Such details were not set down and so are lost forever, lost and forgotten, like the crumbling bones that lie in unmarked graves." And then actually, as recently as 2019 in the New York Times, there was a piece about Chinese railway workers in the US, which said, "The lived experience of the railroad Chinese has long been elusive, partly because no sources written in their own hand survive." So those were two historians, experts, who were telling us that there was nothing to be found. So, don't give up. If you happen to have something in your attic, look through it, because one never knows what one can find. And it can transform history and teach us so very much about the history that at the moment is official, the history that we learn in school, the official histories, when in fact there's so much more history available to us. I should tell you that when I was working on the film, the difficulty that so many filmmakers have, and that was the difficulty that I had, is raising funds to make a film. So in fact, that film never got made. However, the years of research and investigation that I did during that period served me so well when it came to writing the book. So now I'm going to read a little bit from the book for you. First, from some observations of mine, and then I'll read you some of Dukesang Wong's diary quotes, and it'll give you an idea of the kind of extraordinary material that it is. The attempt to shed new light on an obscured part of our continental history needed original voices, someone's long forgotten notebooks or letters. I began to search for such a voice in China, especially in the region called the Siyi. I searched in cities and villages like Taishan and Baisha and Kaiping. I visited museums, and I was shown artifacts brought back to China more than a century before from New Zealand, Australia, Oregon, British Columbia. By the time I began to question my conviction that something would surely turn up. So I came back to Canada, and I've told you the story of that search. So when I finally got the call from the woman who had done the translations and went to visit her, she essentially gave me the diaries, her translation of the diaries, and encouraged me to do whatever I could. I sat in her living room, reading through pages of her 42-year-old undergraduate sociology assignment, and I realized I was holding a paper which included translations of the very kind of document which so many people had said did not exist. And I was ecstatic, and she was thrilled that someone was taking an interest. Oh, I should tell you that we tried actually to get Wanda Joy to be a part of this conversation today, and unfortunately she's ill and is not able to take part in opportunities like this. She lives in Ottawa, still alive, and she lives in Ottawa. The actual diaries which she used to do her translation were contained in 7 notebooks that were tragically lost in a building fire in the 1970s. And unfortunately, no copies were ever made, no photographs taken. And the only translation of those diaries that exists is Wanda Joy Hoe's translation, Dukesang Wong's granddaughter. The first decade or so of the diaries, which began in 1867, I won't talk about today. As I told you, those are the years in China. But I'm going to read now a few quotes from his diary. The first couple of quotes come from the period between 1883 and 1886, which were the years that part of the years that he worked on the railway. First one is autumn 1883. My soul cries out, I wish I had never experienced such bad days as those in which we live now. Many of our people have been so very ill for such a long time, and there has been no medicine nor good food to give them. Even the strongest of us are weak without medicine to fight against these diseases, which spread very rapidly. It is such a sorrowful sight. And spring 1884. These are troubled times for us Chinese. How does anyone work when so ill? Many are killed when such words are spoken, and we are becoming more like dogs biting at one another. My attempts at speaking are senseless. My words mean less than nothing. I am of so little help to everyone. Then in the late summer of 1885, he writes, I am truly alone amid the dying. The leaders of the white people demand money, our poor savings, taken from we who have so little given to those who are not so taxed. Some who are very ill have taken to spending their days in the opium shacks with little food and even less strength. This is a bad omen. Spring 1886. There is much work to be done and not enough people to labor at it. So many of us Chinese suffered and died recently, I cannot recount them all. But the Western people will not allow us to land here any longer, while they scold us for not working enough. How these acts wear my soul down to nothing. The laws the white people have enacted prohibit any further landing of our people. I cannot understand why. The work is great. There aren't enough laborers. But my words are meaningless, and my strength to speak now falls upon deaf ears and closed eyes. These mighty lands are great to gaze upon, but the laws made here are so small. I don't think there's another line in the book that struck me so much as that one. These mighty lands are great to gaze upon, but the laws made here are so small. By the summer of 1886, the railway was complete and only a handful of Chinese workers were kept on, including Dukesang Wong. The rest had been cut loose by the CPR, and some literally died of starvation. They were described as skeletons living in caves along the Thompson and Fraser rivers. Some had the good fortune to be taken in by indigenous communities, and their descendants are still in those communities today. In the summer of 1887, Wong was working on track repair in the Ashcroft and Savinaw area. And in spring 1888, he was living in New Westminster, where he met a man from his home region in China. The man offered Wong a partnership to set up a tailoring business. Wong accepted, and within a year, they were operating a successful shop in New Westminster's Chinatown. Once he was established, he returned to China to arrange travel for the young woman to whom he had been betrothed. A couple of years later, they were married in Victoria. The business continued to thrive, and Wong became a leader in his community. The headmaster of the Chinese school, a leader in the Chinese Benevolent Society, and the Wong Clan Society. He became a supporter of Dr. Sun Yat-sen and may have hosted him at an event in New Westminster. He and his wife had 8 children. The last one, Elsie, their only daughter, was born in 1918, and the diary entry announcing her birth was the last one translated by Elsie's daughter, Wanda Joy Hoe, 50 years later. I don't know how, and nor can she really shed any light on how much more was available in the diaries than what she decided to translate. Her essay was very focused on a family transition from China to Canada. as opposed to so much else that was contained in the diaries. So it's possible that that fire tragically lost us a whole lot more that we could have and don't. So I read a couple of diary entries from the early parts, which were the bleakest and darkest of the diaries. And I want to now read from the end of the diary, because the tone changes, and you'll see. Just a quick drink here. Spring 1916. Sadness fills so much of me, yet joy is also in my soul in these warm days. Second son has left with the missionary ship to journey to the homeland. His going leaves us with such heavy hearts, for I already feel I shall not hear his laughter again. I have allowed his journey, as a man must cease to linger in his home when searching for knowledge, though I greatly fear his search will lead him to much physical pain. Third son departs soon to enter university in the eastern part of these lands. His abilities in learning are high, and I am humbled by the honor which he has achieved in attending university. There is a zeal in his desire to help the ill and the ailing, and it is unworthy of me to wish to hold him here for fear the Western's government will send him to fight in France like so many others. It is said that the old ways cannot always last, and that people must change and be continuously renewed. I have even taught this, yet I fear that I cannot change enough for this new world. And now this is the very last diary entry from autumn 1918. It is the feast of the full moon. I am doubly blessed, for in my desires, I have both prayed to the Christian God and allowed incense to be burned in our garden. My fate now has provided a daughter, a precious eighth child, a great joy for all this house. Her brothers will know this goodness and take care of her, loving her. She has come in my old age, a joyous sign, and she will be able to bring me pride, I know. It is good. Her brothers are men now, so she will be assured a good life. She will look after Lynn when I leave these lands for the final journey homeward. Though he anticipated his own death with those words, Dukesang Wong lived another 13 years. He died in Vancouver in 1931 at the age of 86. Today, he has descendants living in cities around the world, including Vancouver, New York, London, Singapore, San Francisco, Ottawa. And thanks to Wanda Joy Hoe's, his granddaughter's translation of some of his more than 60 years of diary entries, the historical record of both British Columbia and Canada has been significantly enhanced. So just in conclusion, I want to read one more section from the book, my observations, because it was an important part of what I wanted to express with this book. So here we go. In the official stories of nation building on this continent, Chinese Canadians and Chinese Americans have largely been absent. And where they are acknowledged to have played a role, many of the details seemed better left unsaid. Yes, they moved rock out of the paths of rail lines and out of the tunnels of mines. They operated laundries and cut timber. They gutted fish and turned deserts into market gardens. But their stories were only grudgingly woven into the national historic fabric of the countries to which they came. It is certainly true that authentic records of any kind are often difficult to find, but pervasive myths tend to dissuade the searcher. The Chinese railway workers were all illiterate, for example, or the Chinese didn't keep diaries, or their diaries could not have survived the decades, or writings taken back to China were all destroyed in the Cultural Revolution, and so on and so on. More accurate explanation for the perceived lack of primary sources might be that racism and violence directed at Chinese immigrants in the United States and Canada throughout much of the 19th century, 19th and the early 20th centuries, included erasing them both from the landscape and from history. On November the 3rd, 1885, in Tacoma, Washington, 200 Chinese men and women were driven out of the city by a mob of hundreds of upstanding citizens, including the mayor and local judges. The men and women were forced to walk a few miles to a small railway station, spend the night standing in the rain, board a train the next morning, and leave the state for good. The next day, the homes and businesses of their Chinatown, along with the contents of those buildings, were burned to the ground. Not a door frame remained. The event became known as the Tacoma Method. Seen as a highly effective way to rid the community of the Chinese, the method was copied in towns and cities spread throughout Western North America. The Chinese were attacked, killed, driven out of towns up and down the continent. Their Chinatowns were torn down, burned down, and forgotten. Their contributions were destroyed, ignored, and dismissed. Is it any wonder that records and personal accounts are hard to find? As a result of these attitudes and actions, the thousands of Chinese who gave their labor and the hundreds who gave their lives to the nation-building projects of North America have been denied their rightful place in its history. Yet, history reveals itself in many and sometimes surprising ways. Time and again, our histories are altered when new evidence appears. And as you can see from this, it does appear, despite the efforts that may have been taken to erase it. Now, I'm happy to take any questions anyone has about all of that.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lara Wilson, the Vice President of the Friends of the BC Archives, and I'd be happy to pass on your questions to David. So please put them in the chat. David, while we're waiting for questions, I just wanted to say that how much your talk aligns with how I often speak to people about the importance of archives, and that a single document or even a single page, a single photograph can change a discourse.
Absolutely.
A single document found in the smallest archives in Canada can change things. Yeah,
I know for sure. You know, and I find myself I'm so constantly driven to encourage people to like the story of the Eastern Townships pioneer woman. That literally happened because my brother-in-law and a friend of his, this friend had just bought some property in the townships, and they decided to walk. It was a large piece of property, and they decided to walk the property and discovered this cabin that no one knew existed, and it was literally falling down. It was, it had not been occupied in years, and something possessed them to go up into the attic, and there they found this absolutely extraordinary document that told an amazing history that informed the history of that region in that time.
Wonderful. We have a couple of questions. The first one, could you tell us a bit more about the responses to your book since it's been released?
Well, I've had a few opportunities to talk to groups like yours, and that's been terrific. Actually, the response has always been very great. The book, I don't know whether you know it or not, but the book was nominated for a BC and Yukon Book Award, which was a nice thing for it to have happened. But I can't. What people keep talking about is how it was possible that we went 150 years without knowing that there were voices from that period, personal voices, personal stories that were there to be found if only we had, made the effort to look.
Mhm. Another question, can you share more about Dukesang Wong's encounters with Indigenous people from what remains?
He tells again, I'm sure the tragedy is that the original diaries were lost in a fire, but so I'm sure there was more there, but he certainly does. He talks early on in the book about having taken a trip somewhere, and on his way back, he traveled with a group of Indigenous people, in dugout canoes, to get him back to wherever it was in the Fraser Canyon that he was working. And he said it was a wonderful experience to be with these people, but it was really uncomfortable in the canoe. And he was sorry that he hadn't had a horse to ride back rather than sitting in this uncomfortable canoe. But then again, later in the diaries, he talks about having been able to get foodstuffs from the venison. In fact, he talks about an Indigenous community gave he and his family a great big piece of venison. And he was so moved that he took 2 of his chickens from his backyard and gave them the chickens. And we do know, of course, that Indigenous people took men into their communities in significant numbers, because they were literally dying in these caves along the river.
Thank you. Another question. What are your, great, from one of our attendees, your presentation and book is very inspiring. What are your overall impressions of this interesting man?
I'll never forget the afternoon I sat in Wanda Joy's living room and read the diaries for the first time, because I was stunned by the erudition, and the poetry in this man's language. And I realized that I was reading the words of a very, very special person, who had compassion for those around him, great compassion for those around him, and suffered not only his own problems, but suffered because of the suffering of his colleagues and co-workers. And his wisdom was the other thing that struck me as I was reading through it. I repeated one line when I was reading pieces from the book, the one about these great lands are marvelous to gaze upon, but the laws made here are so small. It's just there were several of those little pieces of wisdom that identified the man to me. And I sort of almost, like, I talk about the fact that I co-wrote the book with him, and I did, because part of the book is, a third of the book is his diary, and the rest is my observations and responses to those entries. And so I almost felt like I got to know him, that we became colleagues or something in the process of writing the book. And Wanda Joy was, in the few times I was able to meet her, because as I said, she's ill. She was great she died. Her grandfather died 13 years before she was born, but she heard many accounts of him, and so she was able to tell us about those tell me about those accounts. And so the more I learned about him, the more I realized that he was a significant figure in the Chinese community, and his voice is an important part of the history of Canada.
Mhm. Yeah. Another question. Is a film about this story still on the table?
You know, I was a filmmaker for 10 years, and I was very happy doing that. I really loved making films, but it's such a commercial venture. And I'm an independent filmmaker. I'm not associated with. I mean, I was helped through my films by the CBC and the National Film Board and so on, but I'm nevertheless an independent filmmaker, and independent filmmakers raise their own money. And it started to become more time consuming to raise the money than it did to make the film. And as a result, I wasn't interested anymore. And I was thrilled when Talon Books found out about the diaries and asked me to write the book instead. And now if someone wants to come along and make a film of the book, more power to them.
The words will endure for sure. I'm just wondering if anybody else has questions for David.
I see there's one there from Nick.
Oh, Kelly has responded to that. So that was just a question about the diaries. Yeah, the origin and where they were. Okay. Last call for questions. Oh, here's a question. Are there photos?
You know that wait a second here. We were able to find one photograph, and it is it's the cover of the book. And as it turns out, and I was surprised to learn this, that most people think this is just an archives photograph of unknown people. But in fact, it is not. It is Dukesang Wong and his wife, and it was supplied by the family, and it's on the cover of the book. But that is the only photograph and that was taken, I believe, in the 1890s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, but and the book does have photographs, but they were essentially chosen by the publisher they all came from the BC archives, by the way, those photographs, but they're not related specifically to Dukesang Wong.
Okay, yeah, beautiful photo.
Yeah, it's a great photo. Great photograph.
Yeah. We have a comment of one of our attendees. Can't wait to read your book. And then from someone else, I'm listening to this as I pack for a train to Ottawa, where I know this person is going to be doing some research at Library and Archives Canada. So I'm especially grateful to hear this historical perspective. Thank you, David.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and excellent presentation. So
good.
Last call for questions. Sorry, just hold on. Okay. All right, David. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.